Welcome. My name is William Messakar. I am a master model railroader in the 4th Division of the Pacific Northwest region of the National Model Railroad Association. I want to welcome all of you to the virtual layout tour we'll have presented today by members of the NMRA. We would encourage you to find out about the NMRA and join in order to participate in these virtual tours. We have other virtual clinics and other activities for the National Model Railroad Association that we think you'll find a big help to your modeling, and you'll get to meet model railroaders just like you. So welcome to our tour, and I hope you enjoy it.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Buckley. I thank you for attending this morning. I'm going to talk about my railroad, the Tehama Valley Railroad. I know many of you probably visited during our layout tours. Some of you have operated here, and I know at least one person here has helped me with a lot of projects on here. So we'll get going on this. Start out how my modeling career started. Christmas 1958, I was 4 years old. I knew I was going to get a train set that year. My parents had told me. And my dad was not a model railroader, but he had probably looked in some of the magazines, and he thought that he knew that HO was the way to go, because it could be expanded. And I believe he was going to order some equipment. Well, about that same time, my mother and Mom took me to the Montgomery Ward's catalog store. Some of you probably remember what those are. And there was a Marx 027 gauge train set operating there. So guess what I had to have? So my parents wanted to give me what I wanted. So on Christmas morning, my dad had built a small table, I think it was a 4x6, and had the train set up. As you can see, this was also my year for fire trucks and buses. I guess it was my year of transportation. Anyway, fortunately, like a lot of kids got their Lionel or their, 3-rail layouts, they'd be put away at Christmas time, but Dad moved it down to the basement after Christmas. He later on got a sheet of 1/4-inch 4x8 plywood, set it on top, relayed the track, so I had a larger railroad. And a couple of years later, I remember we were down there one day, and I was, I guess, running my train, and Dad was doing something, and I started complaining I didn't have enough room, and in disgust, I guess my dad was sick of listening to me. He found a 2x8 sheet of plywood, reconfigured it, so now I had 6x8. The train set grew a little bit. We had a family friend whose whose kids were older, and they had outgrown it. So my dad bought a set from them. I think it was also Marx, had an engine, some freight cars, and also 3 New York Central lighted passenger cars, which I thought were really cool. So for reasons I won't get into today, I really started getting interested in railroading in particular in 1963, 64. We looked at some model railroader magazines we started buying at that time, and soon realized that the old man was right. 6 years earlier, we should have gone with HO. So we ended up giving the HO set away to another kid. And this was from my first set. I bought it my dad bought it at a store in town called Toy World. And he wasn't a hobby shop, but he had a lot of the blue boxes and a lot of things in stock. Anyway, this is from the original set. I dug them out the other day to take this picture. It included these cars plus a flat car. The freight cars were all Athearn blue boxes that Dad assembled. The engine was a Mantua 060 kit. I think it listed for $12 in those days. Dad assembled it. Years later, I paid it for my Tehama Valley. I just need now to remotor it and put a decoder in so I can run it on the layout someday. So this was replaced the 3-rail layout on the 6x8. My dad later on added 2 tables. So we had a pretty large layout. There was a loop and track went all the way around. And the original table, there was an inside loop. We tried to make a yard. Equipment, started getting more equipment, more freight cars, and more engines. Ended up with kind of an eclectic collection of everything from the Mantua General, which we never got to work, and some accompanying Civil War passenger cars, to the latest diesel, or not the latest, but almost the latest, which was the Santa Fe GP20, as we called them in those days. Now is a Tyco kit. We, the layout got as far as track work, I had, one thing we didn't have was a mentor, somebody to help us, how to build this thing. My dad had done a great job on the bench work, the wiring, the track work. But as far as scenery, I think I put down some ground sawdust. I built some roads out of plaster Paris. We had a lot of plastic kits we'd assembled, but I think I must have lost interest in about 3 years. And my dad figured I was taking up too much space for what I was getting out of it. The layout was disassembled, replaced it with a kind of a shelf layout, 3 feet wide, went along, I think, one wall, part of another. I couldn't get interested in it, just a point to point, it just didn't work for me. I think we disassembled that, tried it again when I was in college during the summer, didn't work out then. And then fast forward to 1980, my dad had retired. He was a railroader at that time. He'd retired from the railroad. And I got the idea he needed something to do. And I had already gotten my first job out of college and I moved out of the house, but I was only 50 miles away so I could come home on weekends. And I talked him into building an HO scale layout, keep him busy. So we built a layout based on a plan and model railroader. I did learn some scenery skills. We got things going pretty well on that one. And then in 1983, my dad had a stroke, which pretty much limited his mobility. So the layout didn't get a lot of use after that. And I finally tore it down in 1993. And anyway, so those are the first layouts I had. So now I want to talk about my prototype inspiration a little bit, as we all have it. The Sierra Railroad I grew up in a town called Sonora, California, was served by the Sierra Railroad, which started in 1897 in a town called Oakdale, which is in the east side of the Central Valley of the northern San Joaquin Valley. The Sierra Interchange with the Southern Pacific, and later on the Santa Fe, ran about 60 miles into the foothills. And I learned about the Sierra in 1963, 64. I'd ridden on a couple of excursions. My mom gave me a book on the Sierra, which I remember my dad read to me because I was still pretty small and I probably reread it a couple times. So the Sierra became, will always be my favorite railroad. It was a real treat to be in the south side of town when the freight came through in the afternoon. And this is what it would look like. And by the way, I didn't take these pictures. I was pretty young then. I borrowed these from our Facebook group I belonged to. So it'd be a treat to always see the freight, hear those 2 Baldwin Road switchers come in, and see the freight. Sometimes maybe 15 to 20 empty boxcars going up to the mill to pick up lumber. The Sierra's main facility was in a town called Jamestown, which was just west of Sonora by about 3 miles. And they had a roundhouse there, turntables, supporting buildings and tracks. Pretty much hadn't changed since 1922. And when it dieselized in 1955, they built a new diesel shop in Oakdale, but everything Jamestown was left as is. And they had 4 steamers were left in the roundhouse. 2 of them would see occasional service either on excursions or for movies, which the Sierra was known for. And they also had a yard full of this cool stuff, which really, if I couldn't have a model railroad with equipment like this, either not so much a derelict state like these were, but at that time, I probably wouldn't want to have a model railroad. So as I said, we lived east of Jamestown. My maternal grandparents lived about a mile west of Jamestown. We'd visit them in the summertime. It was always mandatory on the way home. We had to pull off the freeway, drive by the yards. We didn't trespass on the property or anything like that, but I could see just this really cool equipment sitting out there. Again, that's what drove my modeling. And I guess I really lucked out in 1968. My dad went to work for the Sierra as a brakeman, worked until 1980 when he retired. He was later promoted to conductor. When they started running these steam excursions in 1971, he became the #2 fireman on the list. So this lucky teenager and lucky young man got to kind of see the back door of all of this. And I really learned to appreciate a short line, the smaller steam locomotives, operations, watching my dad make up a freight train, things like that have influenced my modeling as time went on. Now the Sierra and several others in this area, the Sierra hauled a lot of commodities in their 123 years, and they are still in business. By the way, the Roundhouse and shops in Jamestown are a now California State Park. You can go there and visit. You can ride the train. Greg and I, and maybe a couple others in this list, visited in September as part of the Narrow Gauge Convention. If you're into steam and you haven't been there, all I can say is go. You won't be sorry. The Sierras, they hold a lot of commodities, but their bread and butter was lumber products. There were two large mills on the railroad towards the end. The West Side Lumber Company in Tuolumne was served by a narrow gauge railroad. The Pickering Lumber Company in Standard had their own standard gauge railroad. And well, the picture of the Roundhouse, this was taken, I estimate, by the engines, probably early 1930s. It still pretty much looks the same, except these engines are all the ones that have survived. The three that have survived are in different places now. But this is probably their typical freight in 1950, leaving Standard, heading towards Tuolumne. And those box cars, one of them may be a load of freight, but the ones with the open doors are headed to Tuolumne to either haul finished dimensional lumber or box shook. To the south a bit was the Yosemite Valley Railroad. And you're probably all familiar with that by Jack Burgess's modeling. Jack started researching this railroad in the early 1980s and built a layout where he replicates it almost inch by inch from August 1939. It's probably the most prototypically accurate layout you're going to find. The YV was built from Merced, which is in Central Valley, where like the Sierra, it interchanged with the Santa Fe and the Southern Pacific, ran 70 miles east to the town of El Portal, and their main focus was to haul passengers from the valley, from the connecting trains to Yosemite Valley. But that kind of died out in the 20s when the roads improved and people started getting their own automobiles. So they had two major freight customers, and one I couldn't find any pictures of, but one is the Yosemite Portland Cement Company had a plant just outside of Merced. They had a quarry about 50 or 60 miles up in the Merced River Canyon where they quarried their limestone. And the YV hauled the limestone down the canyon to the cement plant in these ancient GN hoppers, which many are still around, or excuse me, they're ore cars. And I do plan to incorporate this on my layout somehow. The second thing they had going for them was the Yosemite Lumber Company had built a sawmill and a lumber mill in Merced Falls, which is a few miles out of Merced. And they had logging operations up in the mountains, pretty much bordering, and in many cases inside the boundaries of the national park. And because the logging operations, they had a standard gauge railroad, because they're so high above where the YV's main line was in the Merced River Canyon, they had inclines where they'd have to lower the cars down. So that's why you see on these cars, you only have a bulkhead at one end. And Yosemite Valley would haul the logs down to Merced Falls where they'd be milled, and then they would haul the finished lumber to the SP and maybe the Santa Fe interchange. Sierra being my favorite railroad and Yosemite Valley my favorite. Some would ask why I would model these, and I kind of wanted to freelance and do my own. I'll explain that in a bit later. There were other railroads that operated on the Sierra foothills that mainly catered to the lumber industry. There are about 3 or 4 Southern Pacific branch lines, a few very short lines. But one that I've really always admired was up, you've all probably heard of the town of Chico, or the city, which is in northern, about 50 miles north of, about 100 miles north of Sacramento. Actually, I went to school there. But Diamond Match, sometimes known as Diamond Lumber, Diamond National, bought some large timber tracts in the mountains east of Chico in the early 1900s. And to harvest that timber, they built a very significant, very big sawmill in Company Town they named Sterling City. They had a railroad which first was a meter gauge, of all things, then later made the standard gauge. Then they built what I call their lumber finishing mill just south of Chico. This consisted of a box factory, door factory, planing mill, and somewhere in here they had a match factory. And to get the rough cut lumber from the mill at Sterling City down to Chico, they built about a 35 mile branch line, which later on was acquired by Southern Pacific. So they would haul these loads of lumber down on flat cars and then finish them at the mill. And this is where the line came in. and this was the Southern Pacific Main Line. Of course, the SP would take the finished lumber out. So I want to incorporate this in my railroad also. Diamond also had something kind of neat. They had a series of retail yards, and these were all different depending on the size of the town they served. Los Molinos was a little town, still is a little town just north of Chico on Highway 99. Before I moved from that area in 96, I went out and I found 3 of these warehouses in 3 towns that still existed. They were no longer lumber yards, but their buildings were standing. I took photos because I do plan to have a couple of these on my layout. And my railroad my lumber company is going to be called the Standard Lumber Company, named after a company that was in Tuolumne County. It was a predecessor of the Pickering Lumber Company. So, and as I was developing all this in my head, I started to get a keen interest in the how the railroads serve the the agricultural industry in the Central Valley. I became interested in the fruit packing industry and fruit packing houses. I built a couple. I plan to build several more. I like the orange and yellow reefers. I have a few on my layout. Also, I like that all these towns, or most of them, would have a feed mill where they would receive feed in 40-foot boxcars, probably the old 40-foot wood boxcars, which I think are kind of cool. They would process the grain into various types of feed, sell to the local ranchers, either in bulk or in sacks. And these 2 shops, the top one is a Tidewater Southern Railroad, which ran between Stockton and Turlock. Originally was an interurban, and most of it, later on, they operated by steam, was wholly owned by the Western Pacific. Here you see they have number 132 has a long string of reefers, obviously during the harvest season. And Central California Traction ran from Sacramento to Stockton, was an interurban that later deslized, and they hauled a lot of fruit, mostly grapes, which were big in that area. What's in a name? Where did I get the name Tehama Valley? If you've ever driven Interstate 5 down through California, you've been through Tehama County. Red Bluff, Redding is up here, Sacramento's down here. Red Bluff is the county seat of Tehama County. And Jim Sable, who many of you know, was down there a few years ago. He got some brochures from there and made this sign and a couple others for my layout. Now, in my alternate universe, there's actually, I'm not in Tehama County, but there is a Tehama Valley high in the Sierras, a pristine valley. And when the founders of the Tehama Valley, they had bought a lot of land up there, and they thought this would be a neat place to have a resort. People would love to go there if they had a train to ride on. So their goal was to build a railroad that far. And incidentally, they also had a lot of tracts of timber up there. And that's the way these people thought in those days. They were I guess the Bill Gates of that era. So anyway, that's where my name Tehama Valley came. My vision statement is it's a fictional short line set in Northern California. I chose them all the 1940s, the late 1940s, for several reasons. I could have a variety of freight cars, box cars, anywhere from 40-foot wooden box cars, maybe even 36-footers, all the way to the steel, 50-foot steel double-door box cars. I could have wood and a few metal reefers, and I could run either steam or diesel. Although since I started building the layout, they've come out with some nice running steam engines. So we'll primarily be steam. And again, it serves the agricultural and the lumber industries. Layout at a glance, like you always see in the magazines. Of course, Tehama Valley Railroad, it's HO. My room size is very lucky to get this. It's 25 by 40. We'll talk more about that later. Talk about my inspiration, the location of it. The era is late 1940s. I kind of focus on 1947, but it can't be anywhere in this era. My track, up until that time, I'd always used Atlas Code 100, and of course 83 had come out then. I did look at Pico Track and some of the others, and I really couldn't even though it would have been like the microengineering Code 70, would have been more appropriate for what I was modeling. I really couldn't justify the cost, so I decided to go with the Code 83 the Atlas Code 83, which I'm very happy with it. Minimum radius is 22 inches. Turnouts, number 4, number 6 for the crossovers I have. I use Midwest cork for most of my road bed. My bench work I'm going to talk about is open grid. covered by 2-inch foam. And height is 48 inches from the floor up to the top of the table. Works very well for me. Scenery is, of course, all the landforms are foam. I use sculpt and mold where needed, real dirt, ground foam, static grass. My backdrop, when I prepped the room, as you'll see, I painted it a dark blue color because dark blue would show up better on photographs. I decided not to go with the backdrop for various reasons, but I got out the airbrush and some reefer white and just kind of misted it a bit to look like far clouds. It doesn't show up in photographs very well, but it has a good effect when you're viewing the railroad in person. I signed on a control system when DCC came out to go with the MRC Prodigy. It does have some glitches, but I'm pretty much satisfied with the way it works. It's fairly easy to teach people how to use it, so I'm happy with that. Features of the layout. Planned to have ample space to have 5 towns, and so there'd be room to, so the town, by the time a train arrived in one town, it would have left the other town. So between the towns, I have scenery like water crossings, bridges. I decided how much of this railroad, which theoretically in my head is 60 to 70 miles long, do I build? I have 1,000 square feet is very generous, and I could have crammed it in there, but I thought I'd be putting too much in. I could have gone with a double-decker layout, but I just didn't want to do that. My mind really couldn't plan where to put the helix and all that stuff. And interesting, Tony Custer, I read one of his editorials lately, is if you read his column, you know he's a big advocate of multi-level layouts, but he even said that if you're building a double-deck layout, it's like building 2 model railroads. And as you're going to see, I'm having a hard enough time getting one built. So I decided just to model the first 20 miles of the railroad. I'm not going to have any spectacular scenery like mountains or tunnels, but I'm going to get to have a lot of switching, a lot of buildings, which I really enjoy building buildings. And I think those that have operated there really appreciate and enjoy the features I put in for operations. Town of Hamilton City, which is where it interchanges with the rest of the world. By the way, all my towns are named after actual towns in Northern California, though they're not in the exact geographic locations, and I didn't attempt to model them. Although Hamilton City is in that area, it's not really on the SP main line. So I interchange with 2 railroads at Southern Pacific. I have another fictional railroad I call the Northern California Traction Company, or Traction Company for short, which is jointly owned by the Western Pacific and the Santa Fe, and that's how they get a share of the business in that area. And there's going to be some industry there, and the main feature will be the maintenance facilities, which include a roundhouse, turntable, and a car shop, which is one thing.
Are they still using electric locomotives?
No, none of them are. No, on my railroad, they would have dieselized by probably the late 1940s. And let's see, there's 3 small towns, Colusa Junction, Walden Grove, and Butte City, which mainly feature industries that serve the agricultural industry. The small city of Oakville, which will be the kind of the finale of the railroad, will have several industries, and it is in operation right now, and there's a lot of switching, a lot of industries you can serve. Also will have a typical small city in the 1940s, commercial and residential area, kind of a place I would like to live if I was in that era, I guess. At the end of that is going to be Standard Lumber Company's finishing mill. It's going to have various parts, planing mill, molding factory, box factory, and a door factory. And my operations will be able to receive flat cars of rough cut lumber from the sawmills in the foothills. Finished lumber products will be shipped in 40 and 50 foot box cars. And everything east of where the mill is will be represented by a staging yard and the loop, which we'll talk about later. The loop was split into turn trains during layout tours and open houses. I started actually thinking about this in the mid-1980s, and I had a small rental house in the 1989. I built a small layout in sections that was very small, and I built which was the original Walnut Grove section, which at that time was a 3x8, later expanded to 3x10, and my intention was to incorporate that in my permanent layout, which I ended up replacing it because I want to use more modern methods. But anyway, this is a plan I drew. I had a drawing program on my old Mac, 1995, and I don't do track plans. I've done some sketches. I don't have the patience, don't want to spend the time to learn a track planning program. I spend too much time behind a computer as it is. So I drew this out. When I want to plan an area, I lay out the turnouts, the track, and I just do it that way. And that seems to work for me. So I planned this layout to fit a space of 25 by 50 originally. This is going to be the first phase, which was the valley division. And this was going to be the mountain division coming up here. And anyway, that was a thought back then. By 2001, I decided 25 by 40 was more doable. I drew up a couple plans, a couple ideas, and finally ended up with this. And this was a sketch I drew up just a couple days ago. And basically, this is what it looks like. We have Hamilton City here. You enter the room here. Hamilton City goes around. This is a whole, this is a pretty large area, 20 feet by 20 feet, which is a pretty large area for one town. But I wanted to have the two interchanges, the Roundhouse and the shops. The Roundhouse and the shops, I want to be a signature scene, so I decided to build it on a peninsula so viewers can view it from all four sides. Originally, it was 3 by 8. Then I wanted to have it a little bit longer. I saw that I could extend it 1 foot longer and not block the entrance to the attic, so I went ahead and did that. And we're going to go over, show pictures of most of these towns. Walnut Grove is finished, actually. There's Sahara Oakville, which is in progress. And the track is all laid here, most of the track, but of course, scenery is still limited. Spring of 2001, Gene Swanson and Mike Shaw and I went to a 4th Division meet over in Bremerton that day. And on the way back, we got to stop and visit Dale Kreutzer's layout. Dale, as you all know, has a wonderful Rio Grande Southern SN3 layout. At that time, he was still, I think, was getting ready to build his scenery. We walked in a daylight basement. He had this very nice, like a family room, which I believe is his crew lounge. His railroad was built in a very nicely finished L-shaped room. He had recessed lighting, which I wished I could have put in. He had his layout completed up to the scenery forms. And I was impressed. Driving home that day, I remember driving over the Narrows Bridge, and I said to myself, I got to do this now. So that summer, I looked at my finances. I saw this was doable. I had a friend who had a house built with a railroad room. I said, hey, do you recommend your contractor? He did. So I met with the owners of Sunwood Homes later that summer. These were great guys. They're willing to work with me. And came up with this sketch of sketch of a layout room with a house attached. Originally, I went back and forth. I want to do a 2-story daylighted basement. Then I decided if I could find a lot large enough to fit it, I would want to have everything on one level because I wanted to live here the rest of my life. And if I ever became any mobility impaired, I'd still be able to get to the layout room. This was modified a little bit in the final plan. For example, I think this whole part, this door was originally moved over here. But visitors can enter through the garage into the railroad room. I can build bench work in the garage, put it in the room. Also, if I just want to go out and work on the layout for 15 minutes, I can walk out from the great room and not have to worry about putting on a coat to go out in the rain or down the basement or anything. So meanwhile, of course, I needed to finance this thing, and I went to a home and garden show that fall, met up, talked to a couple lenders, and one lender was very willing to work with me. Shout out to Twin Star Credit Union, got the financing. They've done a lot of financing with them. I'm very happy with them. So got that part of it done. The key was now to find a lot that I could afford that would fit this on. And I looked at several areas and I ran across a development not too far from where I worked in Tumwater. I ran across it by chance, by accident. And they had like about half the lots were still available. Did some research, found this pie-shaped lot on a cul-de-sac that met my needs, purchased it later in 2001. Construction of the house started in, I don't remember the exact month, like I think April of 2002. Here's a railroad dune taking shape. Originally, I'd asked the contractor, I said, I wanted the whole thing built as one build, so I could start building that layout right away. He said, well, if I build all of it, it's called habitable living space. And according to the county rules, I'd have to have 110% natural lighting requirement. And I thought, well, for a layout room that's going to be built around the wall, I don't want a bunch of windows. So we built it as an unfinished shop. So the building inspector bought off on it. After that was all done, I later had all my subs come back. I had the heating ducts put in. The electrician came back, did the electrical, the insulation, the drywall. I went ahead and painted the room, the ceiling and the room. Never want to paint 1,000 square feet of ceiling again. And then I had the flooring company came in, put in commercial grade carpeting. As far as the windows, my first thought was I didn't want to have windows in here. I was talking to George Bono one day. Some of you know George, and he suggested, he said, well, you're going to need some ventilation in there. He suggested I use what I call these bathroom windows. So I had 4 of those in, and I'm glad I did, because it does, especially in the summertime, if you have people in there, you need that little bit of cooling. It makes a good cross draft. But I'm sure people wonder, why in the heck does this guy have an extension office garage with 4 bathrooms? Anyway, so November 10th, 2003, this was right after the guy had finished installing the carpet, ready for a railroad. See, I already done all painting, everything. Here's the entry where you come in. Here's the opposite corner, diagonally across. About that same time, I decided to use, instead of trying to find 1x4s, Jim Yonkins helped me out. We got a load of 3/4 inch plywood. We ripped some 1x4s on his radial saw I used for bench work. I'm gonna kind of speed along here, but I want to talk a little bit about my bench work. Jim Sable's commented several times on how my bench work looks so spindly, but yet it's so strong. And I'm not gonna go over these, but this is just how I secured it. I put spacers between the studs. I screwed. Well, the main crux of this whole thing is I wasn't sure how to build bench work and to assemble legs, so I decided to think like a bridge. You have the bents of your bridge, you have your decks. You have the bent wherever 2 decks cross, and you screw your tables together. This isn't shown here, but I did that. You have to be very sturdy. I used foam, 2-inch foam. I didn't use plywood. I used, again, Elmer's glue, yellow glue, to glue it down. This was the bench work Ray got right, and I finished in 2016 for the final part of the bench work. Now we're going to do a little tour of the railroad to kind of sum this up. This is the town of Hamilton City. The Tehama Valley main line goes here. There's going to be a traction company who's going to have a line back here. Going to have a packing plant, a cannery, and some commercial buildings here. This is the Southern Pacific interchange yard here. As we move on, actually, here's another part of it down there. Here's the engine facility. I'm going to scratch build a roundhouse out of evergreen styrene and the car shop, because it's going to be corrugated metal. Here is the turntable that Greg Wright and I have been building. It's a Walther's turntable and a New York Railway supply mechanism that Greg actually installed. I wouldn't have had the patience for it. We've been trying to get that thing going. We've been trying to get it tuned so it's programmed just right. This is the traction company interchange. I have an ice deck in the back where we can ice, where the reefers have to be iced before they go up to the packing sheds. And again, when they come back they go to interchange. And the traction company interchange, these 3 tracks here. 3-mile siding, I wished I could have built it longer. I can use it as a packing siding if the trains are no longer than 8 or 9 cars long. Want to go to one of the first things I built on the railroad, and that was the bridge over Butte Slough. I'd never built a trestle before. I wanted to build one. Here's a view of a westbound train. Here's an eastbound train going over. I built a jig out of styrene to build the bents. And anyway, that's how that. Have plans for a couple more trestles, probably not as long as this though. Town of Colusa Junction is the first town we have. we come to. And the first plant you see is the E.L. Moore Fertilizer Company, which is built based on plans in the model railroader from 1970. This was scratch built. And even though the actual building was in the Carolinas somehow, I believe it could have been in the Sacramento Valley. There's some industries here yet to be built. They're switching the fertilizer plant. The George Nichols company was also a plant out of model railroaders, a small feed mill. The railroad would deliver feed or grain in 40-foot boxcars and be sold to the customers. Now we are leaving Colusa Junction. Train out in the country. This is a favorite rails fan spot where the S-curves are. Now we are approaching, going over the Sacramento River. This is a Central Valley kit that was a challenge to build, and finally got it built. The directions weren't very good, but since then they have directions on YouTube, which I wished I would have known about then. And approaching Walnut Grove. Walnut Grove was the first town I built, and with the exception of details, it's finished. A lot of scratch-built buildings. This is the Bachman-Turner feed mill. This was scratch-built. The warehouse next to it was kit bashed. You can see in the back, here's my town, mostly kits, some kit bashes, some scratch-built. Looking ahead, you see this is a warehouse for the Walnut Growers Association. Here's a warehouse for the fruit packers. Here is a cold storage and ice plant. Looking back, the same scene. Just here's some other views of it. Let's see. And I want to talk about a couple things here. The Albert Uvelli was my maternal grandfather. One story I do have to tell is he was an Italian immigrant. About 1910, he delivered produce to a hotel in Sonora where my grandmother, who was also an Italian immigrant, worked, and that's where they met. And if that hadn't happened, you'd be obviously listening to somebody else right now. So I just had to name something after him. So I built a packing shed in his honor. By 1947, passenger service was reduced to a single motor car. Here he's heading west, leaving Walnut Grove. Here's another shot of the packing shed I scratch built. Here's the fuel distributors. I'm going to have several of those. The town of Butte City, I just have one picture of that. That's going to be a small area. Going to have a feed mill, a couple of oil distributors, and Simonian's Packing, which is named after my wife's father, is going to be a very significant packing house. We can load up to 5 reefers there if wanted. I'm going to finish up with the town of Oakville, which is still under construction, is under operation. It's going to have several agricultural related industries. Like there's going to be a cannery here, packing houses, a feed mill. Here's a couple more views of what it's going to look like. Last thing I have is the staging loop. It serves 2 purposes. I can run a train from Hamilton City, turn it on the loop and back to Hamilton City for an open house. I also use it as staging. And these are 2 trains waiting staging. My operations, we always start with 2 trains that are coming down from the foothills. And here they're waiting to come in to open the operations session. Operations, I never thought much about operations until I met the likes of Jim Yonkins, Greg Wright, and Brian Ferris. So finally, I decided I need to get on operations. We had our first session on October 28th, 2012. You probably recognize some of the people in that picture. And you can see the railroad at that time didn't extend beyond Walnut Grove, so I could only accommodate 4 operators. Participated in Ole Ops for the first time that year. I've operated every Ole Ops ever since. These are from a couple different sessions. You probably know some of these people. Participated in every sound rail since 2014. So now I want to do a shout out to those who have helped make this railroad possible. When I started building this railroad, I originally planned to work by myself. I didn't want to have work parties. I didn't want to, have to assign work, but I learned later some of these projects you need an extra person or 2. And there's some things I'm just not proficient at and other people are. So I want to thank those who are making this thing possible. First is Greg Wright, who's been a great friend and a great helper on this railroad. He's installed decoders for me, tuned engines. He helped me with bench work. He's built some structures for me. Most recently, we've been installing that turntable. Again, Greg is a tremendous help on this railroad. Brian Ferris has helped me with a lot of decoder installations. He has Decoder Pro, so he's helped troubleshoot decoder problems in my engines. He has all my data on my decoders I know in his Decoder Pro program. Robert Grove helped put up some of the lighting balances along with Greg and Brian. You need tall people for this. Robert was also my layout assistant at my early operating sessions. Jim Sable, who most of you know, is Jim's just a great person who will help, generous, will help almost anybody with anything if you ask him to. And Jim was my layout assistant at some of my open houses, and I really appreciate it. Last but not least is my wonderful wife, Diane. We met in January of 2014. First time she came over and saw the layout room and saw the commitment I had here. She could have turned around and ran the other way. She chose not to, fortunately. A couple months later, we had our annual layout tour. I showed her how to run a train, operate the throttle. It was a hectic day. I had a lot of visitors. Jack Hamilton and his entourage came by to do merit judging. I had a room full of people. So I was able to talk to the people, explain what I did on the layout, and Diane kept those trains running and kept them on the track. That's all I have. Any questions?
Great presentation, Scott. And I like the thoroughness with which you demonstrate the plan and your thinking behind what you've done.
So are you planning, I know I've had the privilege of operating there, Scott, are you planning to have much more sophisticated operating sessions or operating processes there?
I think for right now it's going to stay at 8 people, but you saw in Hamilton City, I put in that area, there's going to be a cannery, a packing shed. I'm thinking I'm going to have a crew, probably one-person crew, to shuttle cars from the yard over to there. So that'd be another person. And when I get the standard lumber company mill built, that's way in the future, I'm going to have a dedicated switcher just for that job. And also I'll be running a passenger train with the motor cars. So it will evolve as time goes on.
Where did you get all those wonderful cars and trucks?
Oh, the vehicles?
Yes.
A few are the Athearn, the classic metals, I think they're called. Unfortunately, they're only short term. They don't come out that long. That's where most of them are from, Classic Metalworks. And you see those advertised in the magazines. They have a website. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of hobby shops anymore, but you'll see them in there. And a couple other manufacturers. I look in the Walthers catalog and I try to buy any that would have fit into that era.
In one of your scenes, you showed a what looked like a motorized passenger car, kind of similar to a Bud. Was that in modeling a gas-powered unit?
That is a Walthers model, which was not out very long. It's shorter than the one that Bachman put out, and it's actually modeled after the one in Maryland and Pennsylvania had. You look at the plans in MR for that in the picture, it's pretty much the same car. And I believe it was a gas electric, and it may have been upgraded diesel electric later, like a lot of those were. It's been a project, and hopefully in 20 years, I can walk out there and see that it's done.
Before they put the drywall up, did you put some markings out so you would know where those studs are?
No, I don't believe I did. You know, maybe I did mark them. I can't remember. I think I might have marked them on the floor and then on the wall before they put the carpeting down.
Oh, Scott, I saw you put the carpet down early on. Was that okay? I mean, did you have any unfortunate accidents on the carpet?
Not at all. And it's that commercial grade carpet where it would be easy to clean up anyway. And I think it's called commercial grade. It was I got the medium, commercial style, the medium grade. I didn't get the most expensive or the cheapest. And it was only $1 square foot at that time. I've been very happy with it.
Scott, do you have any kind of a dust problem in your train room because of the carpet?
No, I don't. For several years, there wasn't a lot of dust in there, but as time goes on, you do. There's not a lot of dust on the layout, though, and I do vacuum it, probably more than I used to vacuum the house. Just a little bit, but not really too bad, as you would think.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, that was a wonderful tour, and I'm sure our YouTube viewers will be enjoying it for many years to come. That's quite a lovely layout.
Thank you.
Hello again. This is another reminder that this virtual layout tour has been brought to you by members of the 4th Division of the Pacific Northwest region of the National Model Railroad Association. And we hope you've enjoyed it. And we want to encourage you to, again, find out about the NMRA online. Both PNR and NMRA have an excellent website where you can get information about joining and participating in this and other activities like our clinics that are held all over the region. So thank you for joining us today and wish you great modeling.